Faithful citizens are good friends of the American Republic, wherever you may be. To those who've been waiting to see the shape and color of my horns, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but my horns are retractable, and this is one of the occasions on which I've been able to make them completely disappear. My undertaking today is to try to tell you in 27 minutes all about the background methods and purposes of the John Birch Society, which job normally requires 2 full days. In fact, a great deal of our present leadership around the country comes from several hundred outstanding business and professional men, many of them nationally prominent and all of them highly respected, who have been kind enough to listen patiently to me for 2 straight days in about 30 different small meetings of selected guests invited for that purpose. You can readily see, therefore, that while the merely difficult we do at once, the impossible will take the full 27 minutes, and I'll plunge ahead. The John Birch Society was founded in Indianapolis on December 9, 1958, by the 11 great Americans who met me there in the first of those 2-day meetings to which I referred a moment ago. Most of those 11 men are today members of our council, which is the top governing body of the society. We are very proud of our council. Informally limited to 30 men, it has 27 members today, which is the highest number yet reached. And it has been remarked by many of our enemies as well as friends that it would be almost impossible to put together in one group a more imposing list of leaders in the American conservative movement. The John Birch Society operates largely through local chapters, usually of between 10 and 20 members each. Merely being patriotic or anti-communist is not a sufficient qualification for membership. Because of our basic objectives, which will be explained presently as well as time permits, we must have associated with us now and in the future only men and women of goodwill, good conscience, and religious ideals. For we are striving to set an example by dedication, integrity, and purpose in word and deed, which our children's children may follow without hesitation. It is this character, quality, and caliber of our membership which so amazes everybody on first learning the truth, after having heard about us mainly from utterly distorted reports in so much of the press and over the air. Senator Barry Goldwater, for instance, although he frequently criticizes me, has repeatedly stated that the finest people he knows in his state are members of the John Birch Society. The Honorable Lloyd Wright, former president of the American Bar Association and one of California's most distinguished citizens, has said the same thing about our members in his state. And we could find you plenty of other most highly respected Americans to confirm this appraisal. It is our deliberate and careful purpose to pull together into one group a body of morally good and truly responsible citizens who are proud of each other and of the society to which they belong. As of today, March the 2nd, 1962, there are still a few states in the Union in which we have not yet even begun any organizing effort. But in all except those very few states, we now have from 1 chapter to 300 chapters in each. We also have a home chapter, which maintains contact with its members only by mail. There are now members of this home chapter in every state, and the roll of a few thousand includes several hundred of the most influential men and women in our country. Also, many of our new members first come into the society as members of the home chapter and are then transferred into local chapters which they themselves help to form or which are formed by others in their community. For taking the lead in establishing chapters and for the supervision and guidance needed to keep them functioning most effectively, we have salaried staff men called coordinators. We also have, in many areas, men and women, either retired or with other jobs, who devote large parts of their time and energy to serving the John Birch Society as volunteer coordinators. We now have several major coordinators supervising these activities. We shall add further coordinators and major coordinators and otherwise increase our organizational strength from the bottom up as rapidly as we can afford it and to whatever extent it seems wise to do so. neither the list of our members of either local chapters or the home chapter is ever given out to anybody. This is, of course, the only basis for all of the descriptive phrases calling us a secret or a semi-secret society. Actually, it is perfectly normal and customary with regard to organizations of almost every kind in American life. If you don't believe it, just try to get the DAR or the Association of American Physicians and Surgeons or practically any of the fraternal organizations to give you a list of their members or tell you how many members they have. Or, for that matter, a lot of other organizations which some of us consider far less wonderful, such as the ACLU or the NAACP. The last I heard, the NAACP was still defying a court order requiring them to give exactly that information in one state where they operate. There is an interesting and ludicrous angle to this secrecy charge. We are not publicity seekers, and all of this huge publicity we have had has literally been thrust upon us. For the first 18 months of the Society's existence, we were going quietly about our business, forming chapters without any fanfare, and putting people to work for the aims in which we believe. There were several very favorable articles published about us here and there, now and then, from the very beginning. And while we didn't seek these complimentary notices, we never tried to avoid them. But the left wing and the liberal press were paying no attention. So when, all of a sudden, they did wake up to discover that there was such a national organization as the John Birch Society, which already amounted to something, they did not put the fact that they had never heard of it before down simply to their own sloppy and distorted viewing of the American scene, but immediately began to shout about the society being secret. And simultaneously, the thought came to them that they could convert this former ignorance on their part into a benefit by using the charge of secrecy as a weapon to harm us. And they have kept on using the description more or less out of force of habit, even after its silliness has been pretty well recognized by everybody. Just how ridiculous the charge of secrecy really is becomes quickly apparent from the facts. Our whole comprehensive presentation of the background, methods, and purposes of the Society is set forth in our Blue Book of about 200 pages, which anybody in the country can buy without the slightest trouble for $2. Our activities are all planned for our members in our monthly bulletins, which are not only obtainable by anybody, but which for several consecutive months this winter, we ourselves sent regularly to every newspaper in the United States, daily and weekly. Anybody who really cares can easily arrange to hear our tape recordings or see our film presentations. At one desk near our switchboard in our home office, we have every publication of the Society in neat piles, and people we never saw before and never expect to see again stream in and buy different items from our switchboard operator all week long. And all anybody has to remember to order any of this same material by mail from anywhere in the United States, or abroad for that matter, is the John Birch Society, Belmont 78, Massachusetts. Such mail orders pour in all of the time and are filled in perfectly routine fashion. We even have what we call a special packet for $5, which includes the Blue Book, a number of sample bulletins from different months, 1 or 2 copies of our monthly magazine, American Opinion, and samples of our other printed materials. But to return to the main theme at this point, we regularly report to our members, and hence to the public, far more about ourselves than do most other organizations even remotely in the same category. And I am glad to pass along to you, for any interest you may have, the following facts from our December 1961 bulletin, which marked the 3rd anniversary of the founding of the Society. We now have about 35 coordinators in the field who are fully paid as to salary and expenses, and about 70 who are volunteers as to some part or all of their salary and our expenses. We have 43 people in our home office in Belmont. Our growth has been very solid, as best shown by the fact that throughout all of 1961, under the incredibly intensive and extensive abuse to which we were subjected, our total resignations amounted to only 2 or 3% of our membership, and we averaged adding that many new members every week. The carefully coordinated attacks against us from all points of the ideological compass have reached a crescendo stage since the first of this year, with the surprising but visible result of solidifying the dedication of our members still further and of stimulating their recruiting efforts, so that our resignations have dropped to almost nothing, and February was the largest month in new chapters and new members since the Society was founded. By any realistic appraisal of our size against our need, we are still very small. But we certainly expect our present growth to continue just as surely and solidly throughout 1962 and in the years to come until we have the 1 million members of fervent patriotism and unassailable character, which is our goal. The John Birch Society is named in honor of one of the greatest young men that America has produced. John Birch was a Christian missionary from a farm near Macon, Georgia, who was in China when we entered World War II. His heroism, accomplishments, and nobility of character were to make of him a legend which the communists could not allow to live. On July 4th, 1942, John Birch officially joined General Chennault's forces in Chongqing as a volunteer. He organized Chennault's intelligence service, rose to the rank of captain in the United States Army, and served with unsurpassable bravery and brilliance throughout the war. He was frequently referred to by both his associates and superiors as the most important man, single man in our forces struggling against the Japanese in China. 10 days after VJ Day, while in uniform on a peaceful and official mission for our government, John Birch was brutally murdered in cold blood by our allies, the Chinese Communists. This was on August 25th, 1945. He thus became probably the first American casualty in that Third World War between the Communists and the ever-shrinking free world, which is still being waged against us 17 years later. A relentless war of which there is no end in sight. Now, you had probably never heard of John Birch before our society came into the limelight. This is simply because the communists in Washington planned it that way. It took 5 years of persistent and determined effort on the part of his parents, aided by Senator Nolan and many other good patriots, to pierce the blanket of oblivion which had been so brazenly thrown over his life and death by communist sympathizers in our government. As the Saturday Evening Post pointed out in a long editorial on January 22, 1955, based on my small book, The Life of John Birch, quote, amazingly, there were in Washington responsible officials who were willing to suppress news of the murder of an American officer, apparently to prevent the American people from rising in their wrath and vetoing further appeasement of communism. End of quote. John Birch was killed by typical communist tactics as a part of typical communist strategy in a typical communist-style war, a continuous, undeclared war in which our enemies observed no rules of international law, of civilization, or of human decency. He commanded no armies, headed no government, converted no nations to his creed. His impact would have been of transient memory and comparatively small importance had not that impact occurred at a time and in a way to supply particulars from which momentous generalizations can properly be projected. With his death and in his death, the battle lines were drawn in a struggle from which either communism or Christian-style civilization must emerge, with one completely triumphant and the other completely destroyed. Partly for these reasons, but even more because John Birch, in all of his short but outstanding career, so typified the best of America, we have named our organization in his memory. If we rediscover some of our sounder spiritual values in the example of his life, recharge our determination from the spark of his courage, and learn essential truths about our enemy from the lesson of his murder, then his death at 26 ceases to be a tragedy, for in a full lifetime he could not have accomplished more. Next, as to our purposes, the John Birch Society is a group of Americans who have voluntarily joined together, one, to combat more effectively the evil forces which now threaten our country, our lives, and our civilization. Two, to prevail upon our fellow citizens to start pulling out of the deepening morass of collectivism and then climb up the mountain to higher levels of individual freedom and responsibility than man has ever achieved before. Three, to restore with brighter luster and deeper conviction the faith-inspired morality, the spiritual sense of values, and the ennobling aspirations on which our Western civilization has been built. The long-range objective of the Society has been summarized as less government, more responsibility, and a better world. We are digging far more deeply into the problems we face, however, and building far more solidly in our coordinated effort to overcome the destructive forces around us than can be indicated by the brief outline of our purposes given above. In the more complete presentations, as in the Blue Book, for instance, we have attempted, one, to outline the nature and the frightening advance of the threats against our nation, our religion, and our civilization. Two, to evaluate these dangers and place them in their proper perspective against the backdrop of world history and the rise of Western civilization. Three, to set forth a positive philosophy and program to which men of goodwill, religious ideals, and humane traditions may rally with confidence and determination. Four, to offer leadership which can make the dedication of such men and women more constructive and more fruitful. And five, simply to describe in detail the organization, function, and the procedures of the John Birch Society. Since defeat of the communist conspiracy overshadows all other objectives at the present time, our action program for the near future breaks down into 10 categories. One, dissemination of Americanist books and pamphlets as widely as possible. Two, increasing the circulation and readership of the best Americanist periodicals. Three, enlarging the audiences of Americanist commentators and newscasters on radio and television. Four, making more effective use through better planning, direction, and coordination of the weapon of letter writing. Five, organizing Americanist fronts for the many different purposes, including the widespread use of petitions in some instances. Six, waking up the American people to the seriousness of our danger by exposing, wherever possible, the pro-communist activities of communist sympathizers. Seven, making it more difficult for hundreds of pro-communist speakers to appear before thousands of unsuspecting audiences without at least some identification as to their slant and background. Eight, making Americanist speakers available for audiences which are now simply by default at the mercy of pro-communist lecturers. Nine, supplying encouragement and renewed hope and determination to anti-communist refugee groups throughout our country. And 10, carrying on an educational campaign on the political front so that our members will understand better and can help their fellow citizens to understand better the issues and candidates offered to them by all political parties. We are already seriously engaged in all but 2 or 3 of those areas of activity, and we shall expand our efforts into every one of the 10 fields just as rapidly as we can. Now, of course, these efforts have brought down on our heads the massive anger and abuse of the communists and of their allies, plus all of the good citizens who, as always, the communists can beguile into doing their work for them. There are several things about the John Birch Society which disturb and even frighten the communists very much. First, even with our present comparatively small size, we have been able to exert some visible influence as a brake on pro-communist moves and measures. Second, in our primary task of getting books and pamphlets which tell the truth out to the public, to wake up more good American citizens to what is really happening, we have been doing an increasingly effective job. Since we agree that it is better to light one candle than to curse the darkness, we have brought out in dollar reprints 12 of the smothered books of the past 25 years, which together tell a fairly complete story of what has really been happening. We have offered these 12 reprints together as a set called 1 Dozen Candles. During the month of December, we sold approximately 10,000 sets of these books. We are still selling them, along with a lot of others, and the communists don't like it. There is nothing they fear so much as the truth. The third big worry of the communists and their sympathizers about us is our potential for the future. It is perfectly obvious that if we can keep on growing exactly as we are until we have as many members throughout the country as there now are comsimps, we shall be able to rout the whole communist conspiracy because of having truth, morality, American traditions, and the vast bulk of the American people on our side. And fourth, a really big worry for the communists is that because of our organizational structure, they have not been able to get inside the John Birch Society in such manner as to split it into factions, diffuse its purposes, and bog it down in internal disputes as they do all other anti-communist groups. We are perfectly willing to have this structure described as monolithic. A monolith is a pretty firm body. Our members all know, and new members immediately find out, that far from exercising any coercion or pressure over their thoughts or actions, we repeatedly remind them never to do anything recommended by our bulletins if it is contrary to their own judgment or consciences. They also know that we are fighting for the preservation, restoration, and gradual improvement of the American Republic, and that a structure designed for the protection of a completely voluntary association like the John Birch Society, from which any member can resign at any time, has no application to government. But the communists tear their hair over this firm organizational structure of ours, which they cannot get at, and which gives us an assurance of permanence and tightly knit strength that other anti-communist organizations do not have. So they rant and rave about our authoritarian body, and with typical communist tactics accuse us of exactly those things they themselves are doing, but which we most assuredly are not. The whole difference can be summed up very neatly in just one point, which you might keep in mind whenever you hear somebody abusing the John Birch Society as being like the communists. The point is this: if a communist disagrees often enough and continuously enough with what he is told to do, they put a bullet in the back of his skull. If a member of the John Birch Society disagrees repeatedly enough with a majority of the things we ask him to do, we give him his money back. And we think you will admit there is a difference. And so, beginning February a year ago, the communists and their sympathizers and dupes launched against us an attack which, for reach and extensiveness, has probably never been equaled in American history. As the 75-page booklet issued by the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee pointed out, the communists have been making the John Birch Society bear the brunt of the whole Moscow Directive of December 1960 that anti-communist groups must be destroyed. As the same booklet emphasized, some parts of this attack have not been equaled anywhere for the viciousness of its falsehoods since the worst diatribes of Hitler's Goebbels in the 1930s. But of course, the communists could never impose the tyrannical rule of 3% of the population over the other 97%, which they repeatedly do, unless they could inveigle anti-communist leaders of that other 97% into unwittingly doing their dirty work for them, deceptively appealing to every motivation in human character, from sordid selfishness to practical politics to misguided idealism. They have beguiled a lot of very good Americans into attacking us too, and have thus thrown the whole American anti-communist forces into that snarling confusion which serves communist purposes so well and is so vitally necessary to their success. We have taken it all in stride as well as we possibly could, and shall do all we can to minimize the friction and bring about greater cooperation and understanding among all anti-communist groups and leaders. But the communist plan, of course, is to destroy each of us one by one. And the fervor and thoroughness with which the communists have continued to guide and spur on this attack on ourselves through their official publications, all the way from the People's World in San Francisco to Pravda and Crocodile and Izvestia and Nedelya in Moscow, can perhaps most easily be shown by this fact. The most official communist publication in the United States is The Worker, published in New York, in which the line is laid down for the faithful. And during the last 6 months of 1961, there was only one issue of this weekly, The Worker, which did not contain an attack somewhere in its pages on the John Birch Society. And a number of issues contained as many as 6 or 7 separate attacks on us at that many different places. And, of course, all of those American publications, Time, Look, the New York Times, and 100 others which, for whatever reason, swallowed or followed the communist line for Castro, have also swallowed or followed the communist line against the John Birch Society, with results that are amazing to behold. Finally, let me summarize for you in one short paragraph all I have tried to say about the function and purposes of the John Birch Society. You and I do not hold this inheritance of ours in fee simple, as our lawyer friends would say, but we are merely tenants for life in this environment for human life, which was created for us by our ancestors and bequeathed by them to us. But in the John Birch Society, we feel that today our generation is rapidly dissipating and abandoning, rather than improving, the material, the political, and the spiritual assets of our marvelous legacy. We are determined to do everything honorable within our power to save for our children and their children this wonderful country and humane civilization which we ourselves inherited. And to that end, we ask the help of men and women of goodwill and good conscience everywhere.